The spring rain lashed in relentless sheets against the windows of Thorn Manor, a once proud estate, now bearing the unmistakable marks of quiet desperation. In the East Scullery, where no lady of quality should ever find herself, Florence Louise Thorne scrubbed at a copper pot with hands that had long ago lost their softness. At 29 years old, she had become a ghost in her own ancestral home, invisible except when her presence could serve as a contrast to feminine perfection. The sound of laughter drifted down from the morning room above, bright and musical, like bells designed specifically to mock her existence. Her 4 half-sisters, products of her father's second marriage to the calculating Lady Edith Thorne, were preparing for yet another social triumph. Helena, Diana, Sophia, and Isabel possessed the kind of beauty that society worshipped with religious fervor. Golden hair that caught sunlight like spun sugar, delicate features that painters immortalized, and figures that made modistes weep with gratitude. Florence possessed none of these qualities, a fact her stepmother reminded her of, with the regularity of church bells marking the hours. If stories of resilience and love against all odds touch your heart, subscribe now. You won't want to miss what happens next. Florence, Lady Edith's voice cut through the manor like a blade through silk. The drawing-room fire needs attending. Must I do everything myself? Florence set down the pot, her fingers aching from the harsh lye soap, and made her way through the servants' corridors. 6 years had passed since her father's death, and she had learned every hidden passage in this house, every route that kept her from being seen by visitors who might ask uncomfortable questions about why a baron's eldest daughter dressed like a scullery maid. The truth, known only to Florence and her late father's solicitor, Mr. Edmund Whitley, was far more complex than her stepmother imagined. While Lady Edith believed she controlled Thorn Manor through the peculiar terms of Baron Thorne's will, which stipulated that the property remained in the widow's care until Florence married or reached her 30th birthday, Florence herself had been working tirelessly to preserve what remained of the family fortune. Each night after the household slept, Florence descended to her father's study, the one room Lady Edith never entered, and conducted business under the name M.L. Thornton. She studied market reports smuggled to her by Mr. Whitley, analyzed shipping routes and crop yields, and made capital ventures that had, over 6 years, transformed a dwindling estate into a secretly profitable enterprise. She had moved her holdings into the expansion of the Grand Junction Canal and managed the careful manipulation of agricultural futures that had paid handsomely when poor harvests struck elsewhere. Moreover, she had cleverly navigated the fluctuations of the London Stock Exchange following the news of the Battle of Waterloo. Lady Edith believed the estate's continued solvency came from her own careful household management and the generous allowances from her daughter's potential suitors. In reality, every comfort her stepmother enjoyed, every new gown for her precious daughters, came from Florence's financial acumen, unacknowledged and unrewarded. "You took your time," Lady Edith observed coldly as Florence entered the drawing room. Her stepmother reclined on a settee upholstered in peacock blue silk, a fashion magazine spread across her lap. "We are preparing for the Earl of Blackstone's ball tomorrow evening. Naturally, the girls must look absolutely perfect." "Naturally," Florence murmured, kneeling before the fireplace to arrange fresh logs. "Helena will wear the white satin with seed pearls," Lady Edith continued, her voice taking on the dreamy quality it always assumed when discussing her daughter's matrimonial prospects. "Diana the pale blue silk, Sophia the primrose muslin, and Isabel the palest pink with Brussels lace." Florence said nothing, focusing on the precise arrangement of kindling. She knew from long experience that her stepmother was building towards something, the way storm clouds gathered before releasing their fury. "I have decided," Lady Edith announced with the air of one bestowing a great favor, "that you shall accompany us." Florence's hands stilled on the fire iron. In 6 years she had not been permitted to attend a single social function. Lady Edith preferred her hidden, a shameful secret, locked in the attic of the family's social standing. "The Earl of Blackstone's ball is the event of the season," her stepmother continued, and now Florence detected the cruel anticipation in her voice. "Lady Violet Ashbury will be there, Lady Caroline Wexford, the Marchioness of Denbigh, all of society's finest, and they will see my 4 exquisite daughters." Understanding dawned with the coldness of winter frost. Florence was not being invited as a guest. She was being brought as a prop, a theatrical device to enhance her half-sister's beauty through contrast. The elder sister, possessing a stately and commanding height where they were petite and curved, with burnished copper hair that glowed in the firelight where they were golden, was to stand beside them like a deliberate flaw introduced into a painting to make the central figures shine more brilliantly. "I see," Florence said quietly, resuming her work with the fire. "You will wear your grey dress," Lady Edith instructed. "The one with the unfashionably modest proportions, and you will keep your hair severely bound. We would not want you to harbour any inappropriate notions about your place." "Of course not, stepmother." "1 year, Florence. 1 more year until your 30th birthday, and then you shall have your inheritance, such as it is. Though what a spinster of such advanced years will do with a country estate I cannot imagine. Perhaps you might open it as a home for other unfortunate women, whom nature has treated unkindly." Florence stood, her task with the fire complete. "Will that be all?" "For now. Though do try to make yourself useful in the kitchen. Cook is preparing tomorrow's menus, and your clumsiness generally requires supervision." Florence curtsied, the gesture so ingrained that her body performed it without conscious thought, and withdrew from the room. Behind her she heard Helena's bright laughter, and Diana's voice saying something about poor Florence in tones dripping with false sympathy. The rain continued its assault on the windows as Florence made her way to the kitchen, but she noticed it no more than she noticed the familiar ache in her chest. She had learned over years of systematic cruelty disguised as familial duty to anchor her movements in a quiet, stoic melancholy. What she did not yet know, as she descended the servants' stairs with shoulders curved by invisible weight, was that tomorrow evening would shatter the careful numbness she had constructed around her heart. That the Earl of Blackstone, a man famous for his calculating coldness and brutal honesty, would look at her with eyes that saw past skin and bone to the formidable intelligence beneath. That he would make a proposal so shocking, so utterly unprecedented, that it would transform her from invisible spinster to one of the most powerful women in England. But first, she would have to endure the cruelest public humiliation of her already difficult life, displayed like a curiosity at a country fair, proof that even a baron's daughter could be marked by fate as unworthy of love. The Earl of Blackstone's ball was scheduled to begin at 9 o'clock precisely, and by 8:30 the carriages had already begun their procession along the tree-lined drive to Blackstone Hall. The estate sprawled across 300 acres of Kent's finest land, its Palladian architecture gleaming white against the darkening April sky, every window ablaze with the light of 1,000 candles. Inside the Thorne family carriage, Lady Edith fussed over her daughters with the intensity of a general preparing troops for crucial battle. Helena's pearls were adjusted, Diana's sleeve was smoothed, Sophia's curl was repositioned. Isabel's gloves were examined for any imperfection. Florence sat in the forward-facing seat, the position of least comfort, wearing her grey dress with its stiff, outdated neckline that covered her throat like a punishment. Her red hair had been scraped back into a knot so severe it pulled at her temples, and her stepmother had specifically forbidden any adornment whatsoever. No jewelry, no ribbons, and no softening touches that might suggest she harbored aspirations toward attractiveness. "Remember," Lady Edith instructed her daughters as the carriage rolled to a stop, "you are the finest young ladies in attendance this evening. Carry yourselves with the confidence that your beauty warrants. The Earl of Blackstone has rejected every match proposed to him for 6 years since his wife's tragic death, but surely one of you will catch his eye where others have failed." The footman opened the carriage door, and Helena descended first, a vision in white satin and seed pearls that caught the light from the entrance torches. She was followed by Diana in celestial blue, Sophia in buttercup muslin, and Isabel in palest rose. Each girl was announced by the major domo in tones of appropriate reverence. Then came Florence, announced as Miss Florence Thorne, in a voice notably lacking in enthusiasm, and she felt the immediate shift in the assembled crowd's attention. Whispers rippled through the entrance hall like wind through grass. She kept her eyes fixed forward, her spine straight through force of will alone, as she followed her stepmother and half-sisters into the ballroom. Blackstone Hall's ballroom was magnificent, a soaring space with walls covered in pale green silk and ceilings painted with classical scenes of pastoral beauty. 3 crystal chandeliers cast their golden light across marble floors, polished to mirror brightness, and the orchestra occupied a raised platform at the far end, currently playing a gentle minuet. "Good heavens," a voice stage whispered nearby. "Is that Florence Thorne? I had heard she existed, but I assumed the family kept her hidden for good reason." "Quite right too," another voice replied. "Standing next to those 4 beauties, she looks like a scarecrow among roses. How cruel of Lady Edith to bring her, though I suppose the contrast does serve a purpose." Florence's face remained impassive, though something cold and sharp settled in her chest. This was her punishment for daring to still exist, for not having the grace to disappear entirely from her stepmother's carefully curated world. Lady Edith positioned her 4 beautiful daughters near the center of the room, where they would be most visible, and instructed Florence to stand slightly behind and to the side. "You may observe," she said coldly, "and learn how real ladies conduct themselves." For the next 2 hours, Florence watched as her half-sisters danced and flirted, each girl accumulating a string of admirers with the ease of flowers attracting bees. Helena danced 3 times with the Viscount of Ashbury. Diana captured the attention of Lord Edmund Sinclair. Sophia charmed the younger brother of a duke. Isabel giggled behind her fan at something a wealthy merchant's son whispered. And Florence stood statue still, feeling eyes slide over her and away, hearing whispers that were not quite quiet enough to spare her feelings. It was at 11:30 that disaster struck with the precision of a blade, finding its mark. Lady Violet Ashbury, one of society's most influential matrons, approached Lady Edith with the Marchioness of Denbigh at her side. Both women had daughters who had failed to secure the Earl of Blackstone's interest over multiple seasons, and both carried the particular venom of those who see their social strategies failing. "Lady Edith," Lady Violet greeted her with a smile that could cut glass. "How very brave of you to bring all 5 daughters this evening." "4 daughters," Lady Edith corrected quickly. "Florence is my late husband's child from his first marriage. She is hardly a daughter in any meaningful sense." "Oh, but surely she counts." Lady Violet's eyes gleamed with malicious amusement. "After all, she is a baron's child, even if nature was less than generous in its gifts." The Marchioness of Denbigh laughed, the sound carrying across the nearby conversations and causing heads to turn. "My dear Violet, you are terrible, though one must admire Lady Edith's charity in bringing the poor creature out. After all, even the unfortunate deserve some glimpse of society." "Quite so," Lady Violet agreed. "Though I dare say it makes your own daughters shine all the brighter. Nothing flatters beauty quite like proximity to its opposite." Several nearby ladies laughed, and Florence felt heat creep up her neck, despite her best efforts at composure. This was worse than the whispers and worse than the sidelong glances. This was open mockery delivered with the confidence of those who knew their social position made them untouchable. "You are too kind," Lady Edith demurred, though her smile suggested she found the comparison quite accurate. "Florence has certain domestic talents that compensate for her lack of more conventional feminine graces." "How diplomatic," the Marchioness observed. "Tell me, does she have any prospects whatsoever, or has she resigned herself to spinsterhood?" "At 29, one imagines the question has answered itself," Lady Violet replied, before Lady Edith could respond. "No doubt she will make some elderly widower, a useful companion in his declining years, someone to read to him and manage his household in exchange for security. It is the best her sort can hope for." Florence's hands clenched at her sides, her nails digging crescents into her palms. She had endured years of private cruelty, but this public dissection of her worth, conducted with the casual cruelty of those discussing the weather, struck something deep within her that had not quite died despite all efforts to kill it. Hope, perhaps, or dignity, or simply the last remnants of the girl she had been before her father died and left her to the mercies of a woman who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. "If you will excuse me," Florence murmured, not waiting for permission before turning away from the little group. She needed air, she needed space, and she needed anything but the suffocating weight of their laughter following her like hounds after prey. She wove through the crowded ballroom, keeping her eyes fixed on the French doors that led to the terrace and the gardens beyond. No one tried to stop her. No one noticed her departure. She was, as she had always been, invisible when it mattered, and all too visible when it did not. The night air struck her like cold water as she stepped onto the terrace, and she welcomed the shock of it. April in Kent carried the last breath of winter, and her thin grey dress provided little protection, but the cold was preferable to the heated cruelty of the ballroom behind her. Florence descended the terrace steps and walked quickly along the gravel path that led deeper into the gardens. Blackstone Hall's grounds were extensive, and she wanted distance, wanting the concealing darkness of the ornamental shrubbery and the sound of the fountain that splashed somewhere ahead, drowning out the memory of those cultivated, cruel voices. When she was certain she was alone, hidden from the house by a tall hedge of yew trees, Florence allowed herself to bend forward, her hands bracing against her knees, and drew in a shaking breath. She would not cry. She had not cried in 6 years, not since the day they buried her father, and Lady Edith informed her that her life as she had known it was over. She would not break now, no matter how much those women's laughter echoed in her mind. "I should have stayed home," she whispered to the darkness. "I should have refused to come." But she could not have refused, not really. Lady Edith controlled every aspect of her existence until that distant 30th birthday, still 1 year away, when the terms of her father's will would finally release her from this elegant prison. 1 more year, 365 days. She could endure anything for that long. She had already survived so much worse. "I had been given to understand," a male voice said from somewhere behind her, cold and precise as a surgical instrument, "that the gardens were empty. I dislike having my assumptions proven incorrect." Florence straightened abruptly, spinning to face the speaker. A man stood on the path behind her, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in evening clothes of such perfect tailoring that they seemed to have been grown rather than made. His face was all sharp angles and aristocratic severity, framed by dark hair silvered at the temples, despite his being clearly not yet 40. His eyes, pale grey in the moonlight, regarded her with the expression of someone examining an unexpected and not entirely welcome discovery. She knew who he was immediately, though they had never been introduced. Arthur James Hartley, Earl of Blackstone, owner of this magnificent estate, host of this glittering ball, and the most sought-after unmarried peer in England, despite his famous coldness and his equally famous rejections of every match proposed to him since his wife's death 6 years prior. "My lord," Florence said, curtsying despite her discomfort at being discovered in such a state, "I apologize for intruding on your privacy. I shall return to the ballroom immediately." "Stay," he commanded, and something in his voice suggested that disobedience was not a possibility he frequently encountered. "You are Florence Thorne." It was not a question, and Florence found herself studying him with more attention than was perhaps proper. He had made no move to approach her, maintaining the distance between them with deliberate courtesy, but his gaze was penetrating in a way that made her uncomfortably aware that he was not merely looking at her, but analyzing her with the same intensity she brought to shipping manifests and market reports. "I am," she confirmed, seeing no point in denial. "You left the ballroom in some distress. Lady Violet Ashbury's commentary, I assume." I observed the interaction from across the room. Heat flooded Florence's face, the humiliation now compounded by the knowledge that this powerful man had witnessed her public mockery. "I merely required some air, my lord. The ballroom was rather warm." "You are lying," he stated flatly, as though commenting on the weather. "Your stepmother brought you to serve as contrast to her own daughters, and Lady Violet Ashbury saw an opportunity for casual cruelty. It is a common enough dynamic among society women who have too much time and too little occupation for their minds." Florence stared at him, shocked by his brutal honesty. "I do not believe that is a subject you should discuss with me, my lord." "Perhaps not, but I have observed you, Miss Thorne, far more closely than you imagine." This statement, delivered in that same cold, measured tone, sent a shiver down Florence's spine that had nothing to do with the April chill. "I beg your pardon?" The Earl moved then, stepping closer along the gravel path, and Florence noticed that he walked with the controlled grace of someone who never made unnecessary movements. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quality of absolute certainty that suggested he was accustomed to being believed without question. "I'm aware that you operate under the name M.L. Thornton, that you have managed your late father's holdings in the funds with remarkable skill for the past 6 years, that you purchased £2,000 worth of coal shares in September of 1813, just before the news of the iron roads began to stir, and sold them 8 months later for a profit of nearly 60%, that you correctly predicted the poor harvest of 1814 and invested your capital accordingly, that you currently hold a portfolio worth approximately £14,000, which you have accumulated from a starting capital of £3,000. Florence felt the blood drain from her face, her hands going cold despite her gloves. She felt a visceral fear of ruin. If he knew, others might know. If others knew, Lady Edith would discover her secret, and that would be the end of everything. Her stepmother would find a way to seize control of those holdings, to prevent Florence from accessing them, and to ensure she remained powerless and dependent until her 30th birthday arrived to release her. "How could you possibly know that?" she asked. "I make it my business to know who the intelligent investors are in this country," the Earl replied, his pale eyes fixed on hers with uncomfortable intensity. "When I noticed several brilliant trades being made under a name I did not recognize, I investigated. My solicitor is quite thorough. It took him 3 months to trace the transactions back to you." "Please," Florence heard herself say, hating the desperate note in her voice but unable to prevent it. "Please do not tell anyone. If Lady Edith learns what I have been doing, she will find a way to stop me. That money is all I have, my only hope of freedom when I finally come of age under my father's will." The Earl regarded her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said something that shattered every assumption Florence had ever held about the way of the Tun. "I have no intention of telling Lady Edith anything. I intend to make you an offer instead." "An offer?" "Marriage." The word hung in the cold air between them like a physical object, and Florence wondered if she had somehow lost her senses. Perhaps she had fainted in the ballroom, and this was some fever dream conjured by a mind broken under the weight of too much cruelty. "You cannot be serious," she whispered. "I am never unserious about matters of business, and make no mistake, Miss Thorne. I am proposing a business arrangement." The Earl clasped his hands behind his back, his posture as rigid as if he were discussing agricultural yields. "I require a wife who can manage significant financial holdings, someone with genuine intelligence rather than the empty-headed social graces that seem to be the highest aspiration of most women in our society. Someone who will not bore me with endless discussions of fashion and gossip. You know nothing about me beyond my investments. On the contrary, I know a great deal. You are 29 years old, considered by society to be firmly on the shelf, despite being the daughter of a baron. Your stepmother treats you as an unpaid servant while living off the fortune you have secretly preserved and grown. You are regarded as unattractive by conventional standards, which actually serves my purposes excellently, as I have no interest in a wife who will attract unwanted attention or romantic entanglements. And you are demonstrably brilliant with money, which is the single quality I value above all others in a potential spouse." Florence's mind raced, trying to weigh these words. "Why would you possibly want to marry anyone, my lord? You have famously rejected every match proposed to you for 6 years." "Because," the Earl said coldly, "I'm tired of managing my investments personally. I hold assets worth approximately £400,000, and I would prefer to spend my time on matters that interest me rather than poring over ledgers and market reports. You, Miss Thorne, are the only person I have encountered in years who demonstrates the combination of analytical skill and aggressive strategy that the stewardship of my house requires. You are proposing marriage so that I can serve as your investment manager." "Precisely. In exchange, you would receive the protection of my name, the freedom of my fortune, and the social position of a countess. You would have complete control over household expenditures, access to the best modistes and jewelers, and the authority to move in the highest circles of society. The women who mock you tonight would bow and scrape before you by next week." It was the most calculated, cold-blooded proposal Florence had ever heard of, entirely devoid of affection or even basic courtship. And yet, as she stood in the moonlit garden with her hands still trembling from the ballroom's humiliation, she found herself actually considering it. "What would you expect from me beyond managing your money?" she asked carefully. The Earl's expression did not change. Competent household management, appropriate social representation when required, discretion regarding the nature of our arrangement, and eventually, if we are both agreeable, an heir. But I would not demand anything you were unwilling to provide, nor would I take any liberties without explicit consent. This would be, first and foremost, a business partnership. Why are you making this offer now? Surely you could have approached me through proper channels. Because I observed you being humiliated this evening, and I realize that your stepmother's cruelty has created an opportunity. You are desperate for escape, Miss Thorne. I can see it in every line of your posture. And I am offering you not just escape, but triumph. Imagine returning to that ballroom as the announced future Countess of Blackstone. Imagine Lady Violet Ashbury's expression, your stepmother's rage, the absolute reversal of fortune that would occur in a single evening. Something dark and fierce stirred in Florence's chest, something she had tried for 6 years to suppress. Anger, ambition, the desire for vindication so sharp it felt like a blade under her ribs. "This is insane," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Quite possibly, but I suspect you are familiar with desperation, and desperate circumstances call for unconventional solutions. I am offering you power, Miss Thorne, real power. The power to never again have to endure mockery from small-minded women who mistake physical beauty for value. The power to control your own life rather than counting days until a birthday releases you from bondage. You would be marrying someone society considers grotesque. Society's opinions do not govern my decisions. I consider you remarkably attractive, but not in the ways society values. Your mind is formidable. Your strategic thinking is exceptional. Your determination to thrive under circumstances that would have broken most people is impressive beyond measure. Those qualities are far more attractive to me than any arrangement of facial features could ever be." Florence looked up at this tall, cold, brutally honest man and felt something shift inside her chest. Not love, certainly not that, but recognition. He saw her in a way no one else ever had, not as decoration or obstacle or disappointment, but as someone capable and valuable in her own right. "If I were to accept this impossible proposition," she said slowly, "how quickly would you want the arrangement to proceed?" "I would announce our engagement immediately, tonight in the ballroom. We would marry within 3 weeks, as befits the urgency of genuine affection." His tone suggested no such affection existed, merely administrative efficiency. "I have already obtained a special license in anticipation of this conversation." "You were that certain I would agree?" "I was that certain you would recognize an advantageous offer when presented with one. You are too intelligent to reject this based on sentimental notions about romantic love. Am I wrong?" Florence thought about her life as it currently existed, the endless labor in her stepmother's household, the years stretching ahead until she turned 30, each one potentially as humiliating as this evening. The secret nest egg she had built that might be discovered at any moment, the complete absence of any alternative prospects for marriage or escape. Then she thought about what he was offering. Freedom, power, revenge, especially revenge. "No," she said quietly. "You are not wrong." The Earl extended his hand, palm up in invitation. "Then let us return to the ballroom, Miss Thorne. I believe we have an announcement to make that will shock society to its core." Florence stared at his offered hand for one long moment. This was madness. This was accepting a cold business arrangement from a man famous for his cruelty and his refusal of conventional sentiment. This was stepping into a life she could not fully imagine, bound to someone she barely knew. But it was also the only path forward she could see that did not end in continued humiliation and powerlessness. She placed her hand in his, feeling the strength of his grip through their gloves, and nodded once. "Very well, my lord. Let us go scandalize England." His lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Excellent. I confess I have been rather looking forward to this." They walked together back through the gardens, past the yew hedges and the splashing fountain, toward the terrace where the light and music of the ballroom spilled out into the April night. With each step, Florence felt her old life falling away like a discarded cloak, and her new life, strange and terrifying and full of possibilities she had never dared imagine, taking shape around her. She was about to become the Countess of Blackstone through the strangest proposal in living memory, and she discovered that the prospect filled her not with trepidation, but with fierce, savage satisfaction. Let them stare. Let them whisper. Let them try to understand how the ugly duckling had somehow captured the most eligible man in England. She knew the truth. This was not a fairy tale. This was a strategic alliance between two people who valued intelligence over sentiment and power over romance. And that, Florence thought as they climbed the terrace steps, made it far more valuable than any conventional love match could ever be. The Earl of Blackstone paused at the French doors leading back into the ballroom, looking down at her with those penetrating grey eyes. "Are you prepared for this, Miss Thorne? There is no returning from what happens next." Florence straightened her spine, lifted her chin and met his gaze with all the fierce determination she had spent 6 years suppressing. "I am prepared, my lord. Shall we begin?" He opened the doors, and together they stepped back into the light and music and shocked silence that would mark the beginning of Florence's transformation, from invisible spinster to one of the most formidable women in Regency England. The ballroom fell silent with the peculiar totality that only true shock can produce. Conversations ceased mid-sentence. Dancers stumbled in their steps. The orchestra, sensing the dramatic shift in atmosphere, allowed their instruments to trail into uncertain quiet. The Earl of Blackstone, still holding Florence's hand with unmistakable possessiveness, walked directly into the center of that stunned silence. His expression remained as cold and unreadable as marble, but Florence could feel the tension in his grip, a coiled readiness that suggested he was not as unaffected by this moment as he appeared. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying across the vast space with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "I beg your indulgence for this irregular interruption of the evening's festivities. However, I find I cannot delay in sharing news of a most personal nature." Every eye in the ballroom fixed on him. Florence saw her stepmother near the refreshment tables, Lady Edith's face frozen in an expression of confusion that was rapidly transforming into dawning horror as she registered Florence's hand clasped in the Earl's. "This evening," the Earl continued, "I have had the extraordinary fortune to secure the acceptance of Miss Florence Louise Thorne to become my wife. We shall be married by special license within 3 weeks." The silence that followed this pronouncement lasted perhaps 3 heartbeats. Then the ballroom erupted into chaos. Lady Edith swayed visibly, one hand clutching at a nearby chair for support. Helena, Diana, Sophia, and Isabel stood in a little cluster near the dance floor, their beautiful faces slack with identical shock. Lady Violet Ashbury, who had so enjoyed mocking Florence mere hours ago, appeared to have forgotten how to close her mouth. The Marchioness of Denbigh recovered first, her voice cutting through the general tumult. "Surely this is some manner of jest, my lord. You cannot possibly be serious." The Earl turned his pale gaze on her with the expression of someone regarding an insect of minimal interest. "I assure you, madam, I am in deadly earnest. Miss Thorne has graciously consented to become my Countess, and I am deeply grateful for her acceptance." "But she is—" Lady Violet began. Then she stopped herself, apparently realizing that completing that sentence might constitute a social offense too egregious even for her status to protect. "She is brilliant," the Earl finished coldly. "She is accomplished. She is possessed of qualities that I value far beyond the superficial attractions that seem to obsess lesser minds. And she will make an exceptional Countess of Blackstone, as I am certain society will discover." Florence stood beside him, her hand still in his, and felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest. Not quite confidence, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile shoots of it. She lifted her chin slightly and met the stares of the assembled company without flinching. Lady Edith finally found her voice, and it emerged as something close to a shriek. "This is impossible! Florence, what have you done? My lord, surely you have been deceived in some manner. She has no accomplishments and she has no graces. She is utterly unsuitable for such an elevated position." "On the contrary," the Earl replied, and now his voice carried an edge that could cut stone. "I have investigated Miss Thorne's character and capabilities quite thoroughly. I find her eminently suitable for my purposes, and I will thank you not to insult my future wife in my own home." The rebuke was delivered with such icy precision that Lady Edith visibly recoiled. Around the ballroom, Florence could see society's calculations occurring in real time, etched across dozens of faces. Whatever they thought privately about the Earl's inexplicable choice, publicly they would have to accept it. To openly oppose him would be social suicide. Already several of the more astute matrons were approaching, their expressions carefully neutral, ready to offer congratulations and secure their positions in the good graces of the future Countess. Lady Arabella Montfort reached them first, her curtsy precise. "How wonderful, my lord. Miss Thorne, you must be absolutely thrilled. Such a love match is so rare in our circles." "Indeed," the Earl said dryly. "We are quite overcome." Others followed, a procession of people who had ignored or mocked Florence mere hours earlier, now offering felicitations with varying degrees of sincerity. Helena, Diana, Sophia, and Isabel were forced to approach their stepsister and curtsy, their lovely faces twisted with barely suppressed fury and jealousy. "Congratulations, sister," Helena managed through gritted teeth. "How very unexpected." "Thank you," Florence replied, her voice steady. "I believe life is full of surprises." Diana's eyes glittered with malice. "One can only hope the Earl knows what he is getting." "He does," the Earl interjected smoothly, "which is more than can be said for most marriages in our sphere, I suspect. Now, if you will excuse us, I believe Miss Thorne and I have much to discuss regarding the arrangements. Good evening, ladies." He guided Florence away from her half-sisters, his hand at her elbow a proprietary gesture that did not escape anyone's notice. They made their way to a quieter corner of the ballroom, where they could speak with relative privacy, though Florence was acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes tracking their every movement. "That went approximately as expected," the Earl observed. "Your stepmother appears close to apoplexy." Florence glanced across the room to where Lady Edith was indeed surrounded by a cluster of women, all speaking urgently, her face flushed with rage and humiliation. "She has just lost control of Thorne Manor. Under the terms of my father's will, her guardianship ends when I marry." "Precisely. I took the liberty of instructing my solicitor to prepare all necessary documents. By this time tomorrow, the property will be legally restored to you, with full rights to manage or dispose of it as you see fit. I assume you will want to make immediate changes to the household arrangements." The realization of what he was saying struck Florence like a physical blow. She would own Thorne Manor outright. She would control her own property. She could dismiss Lady Edith, or better yet, offer her a small cottage on the grounds and the satisfaction of watching her former tormentor reduced to dependence on the stepdaughter she had treated so cruelly. "Yes," Florence said quietly. "I believe I will make several changes." "Excellent. I shall have my man of business contact your solicitor. I assume it is still Edmund Whitley." "You truly did investigate thoroughly. I believe in understanding the complete situation before making significant decisions. Speaking of which, we should discuss the practical arrangements of our marriage. I maintain residences in London, Kent, and Yorkshire. My primary estate is Blackstone Hall, where we are now. I spend most of the year here, traveling to London for the season and to Yorkshire for the autumn hunting. You will naturally have your choice of residence, and I will ensure you have unlimited access to funds for your personal use and household management." He spoke as if discussing a business contract, which Florence supposed he was. Yet there was something reassuring about his directness and the absence of romantic pretense. She knew exactly where she stood with him, which was more than she could say for anyone else in her life. "What about your expectations regarding an heir?" she asked, keeping her voice low. The Earl's expression did not change, but she sensed a slight tension in his posture. "I will not press you on that matter. When and if you decide you are comfortable with the physical aspects of marriage, you need only inform me. Until then, we shall maintain separate chambers and a cordial but distant arrangement. I am perfectly capable of patience." "That is unusually generous. I prefer to view it as practical. A child conceived under duress or without genuine willingness serves no one's interests, and I have no desire to force myself on an unwilling partner. When you are ready, if you are ever ready, we shall discuss it. Until then, the matter is closed." Florence studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden cruelty, but found only that same calculating coldness that seemed to define him. He meant what he said, she realized. This truly was a business arrangement to him, and he would honor its terms with the same precision he applied to his financial dealings. "I accept your terms, my lord." "Arthur," he corrected. "We are to be married. You should use my given name, at least in private." "Arthur, then, and you should call me Florence." "Florence?" He tested the name as if evaluating a new investment. "It suits you. Strong, classical. It is not one of these overly ornamental names that half the debutantes seem to carry." Despite herself, Florence felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward. Was that a compliment? An observation? Though I suppose the distinction is minimal. He glanced around the ballroom, where the chaos of their announcement had settled into intense speculation and gossip. "I believe we have accomplished our primary objective for the evening. Shall I escort you back to your stepmother's carriage, or would you prefer to remain and savor your victory?" Florence looked across the room at Lady Edith, at her half-sisters, at Lady Violet Ashbury and the Marchioness of Denbigh, and all the others who had found such amusement in her humiliation. Then she looked up at the man who had just transformed her life with a handful of cold, calculating sentences. "I believe I would like to leave, actually. I have had quite enough of society for one evening." "As you wish. I shall call on you tomorrow at 2 o'clock to discuss the arrangements with your stepmother. I suspect that conversation will be most enlightening." He offered his arm, and Florence took it, feeling the solid strength beneath the fine wool of his coat. Together they walked through the ballroom toward the entrance, and with each step, Florence felt the weight of 1,000 stares following them. Let them stare. Let them wonder. Let them try to comprehend how this impossible thing had occurred. She was going to be a countess. She was going to have power and freedom and the ability to never again endure cruelty from those who mistook beauty for value. And if the price for that was a cold marriage to a calculating man who saw her primarily as a useful investment manager, well, she had certainly endured far worse for far less. The Earl handed her into the Thorne family carriage, where Lady Edith and her daughters waited with expressions ranging from fury to disbelief. Before he stepped back, he leaned close enough that only Florence could hear his next words. "You were magnificent tonight. I believe this arrangement will prove even more advantageous than I initially calculated." Then he was gone, striding back toward the hall with that controlled grace, leaving Florence to face her stepmother's rage during the carriage ride home. It was going to be an unpleasant journey, but Florence discovered she did not particularly care. Because in 3 weeks, she would never have to answer to Lady Edith again. In 3 weeks, she would be the Countess of Blackstone, and that cold, calculating Earl would be her husband and ally. Not a love match, certainly, but perhaps something more valuable. A partnership based on mutual respect and shared interests, and the absolute certainty of what they were each getting from the arrangement. As the carriage pulled away from Blackstone Hall and Lady Edith began her furious interrogation, Florence looked out the window at the moonlit gardens where her life had changed forever and allowed herself the smallest, most private smile. Revenge, she was discovering, tasted remarkably sweet. The wedding took place exactly 3 weeks later, in the chapel at Blackstone Hall, a small affair attended by only the most essential witnesses, despite being the social event of the decade. The Earl had insisted on privacy, and Florence had been grateful for it. She had no desire to parade their unusual union before all of society, not yet, not when she was still adjusting to the seismic shift in her circumstances. Lady Edith had been forced to vacate Thorne Manor within a week of the engagement announcement, relocated to a small but comfortable cottage on the property's edge with a modest allowance. Her 4 daughters had scattered to various relatives, their matrimonial prospects suddenly complicated by their connection to the stepsister they had tormented. Helena had married a merchant's son in an arrangement that would have been unthinkable before the scandal. Diana remained unwed at 23. Sophia and Isabel had been sent to an aunt in Bath, and their London debuts were indefinitely postponed. Florence had watched their dispersal with a satisfaction she did not bother to disguise. She was not cruel, but neither was she inclined toward forgiveness. Lady Edith received enough to live comfortably but not grandly, which was a precise punishment for years of systematic cruelty. Now standing in the Earl's private chapel, wearing a gown of ivory silk far finer than anything she had ever owned, Florence listened to the vicar intone the marriage ceremony and felt strangely calm. This was a transaction, she reminded herself, a beneficial arrangement for both parties. There was no need for nervousness or sentiment. I, Arthur James Hartley, take thee, Florence Louise Thorne, to be my wedded wife, the Earl said, his voice as steady as if he were signing a business contract. To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health till death do us part. Then it was her turn, and Florence heard her own voice responding with equal steadiness. I, Florence Louise Thorne, take thee, Arthur James Hartley, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. The ring he placed on her finger was a band of gold set with a single large emerald, and the stone was dark green and flawless. It was beautiful in a severe, uncompromising way that reminded Florence of the man himself. I now pronounce you man and wife, the vicar concluded. You may kiss the bride. Arthur regarded her for a moment with those penetrating grey eyes. Then he leaned down and pressed a chaste kiss to her lips. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, perfunctory and businesslike, which was exactly what one would expect from this arrangement. And yet, Florence thought she detected something in his expression as he drew back. Not affection, certainly not that, but perhaps a kind of satisfaction. They had both gotten what they wanted from this bargain. The wedding breakfast was served in the blue drawing room, attended only by Arthur's solicitor, Florence's former solicitor, Mr. Whitley, and 2 witnesses required by law. Conversation was minimal and focused on practical matters. Arthur reviewed the documents, transferring full control of his holdings to Florence's management. Mr. Whitley confirmed that Thorne Manor was now legally hers, free and clear. The solicitor discussed the settlement Arthur had arranged, which provided Florence with £5,000 per year for her personal use, separate from household expenses. It was the most coldly practical wedding breakfast in the history of England, and Florence found it perfectly suited to her temperament. Afterward, Arthur informed her that he had business in London requiring his immediate attention and would be absent for approximately 1 week. He suggested she use the time to familiarize herself with Blackstone Hall and interview the household staff. He had instructed the housekeeper, Mrs. Dorothy Blackwell, to provide Florence with complete access to all areas of the estate and full authority over domestic arrangements. I trust you will find everything in order, he said as they stood in the entrance hall, his traveling trunk already loaded onto his carriage. But if you identify any inefficiencies or areas requiring improvement, you have my authorization to make whatever changes you deem appropriate. You are giving me complete control of your household? Florence asked, somewhat surprised despite everything. You are my Countess. It is your household now. I have no interest in micromanaging domestic arrangements. If you require additional funds for renovations or improvements, inform my man of business. I trust your judgment. With that he departed, leaving Florence standing in the grand entrance hall of Blackstone Hall, now her home, legally and irrevocably the Countess of Blackstone. Mrs. Blackwell appeared from a side corridor, a woman of perhaps 50 years with steel grey hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She curtsied deeply. My lady, welcome to Blackstone Hall. His lordship has instructed me to place myself entirely at your disposal. Shall I show you to your private apartments? Florence's rooms occupied the entire east wing of the 2nd floor, which was a suite of chambers so vast they could have housed her entire former household. The bedroom was decorated in shades of cream and gold, with a 4-poster bed large enough to sleep 4 people. The adjoining sitting room contained a writing desk, comfortable chairs, and shelves already stocked with books on history, philosophy, and notably economics and finance. The dressing room was larger than the chamber she had occupied at Thorne Manor. His lordship had these rooms completely redecorated for your arrival, Mrs. Blackwell informed her. He specified that you were to have the finest of everything, and he said that the sitting room should include a private study area for your work. Florence ran her hand along the writing desk's smooth surface, noting the fresh ink, quality paper, and organized ledgers waiting for her attention. He had thought of everything, she realized. This was not the gesture of a romantic husband, but rather of a practical partner, ensuring his business associate had the proper tools for success. Over the next week, Florence threw herself into understanding her new domain. She reviewed household accounts and found them impeccably managed. She interviewed every member of the staff, from the head butler to the lowest scullery maid, and she found them universally loyal to their earl, but curious about their new countess. She inspected the gardens, the stables, the home farm, and the extensive library that occupied the entire ground floor of the West Wing. And in the evenings, alone in her study, she began the work Arthur had hired her to do. She examined his holdings with the intensity of a general planning a military campaign. £400,000 represented an enormous responsibility, and she was determined to prove herself worthy of his trust, mercenary though it might be. The holdings were complex. There was land in Yorkshire, Kent, and Cornwall. There were shares in multiple coal mines and textile manufactories, and there were government bonds, shipping shares, and agricultural futures. Some positions were brilliant, others needed refinement, and a few should be liquidated entirely so that the capital could be redeployed to better opportunities. Florence worked late into each night, her excitement over the intellectual challenge overcoming any fatigue. This was what she had been training herself to do for 6 years, managing money with skill and precision. But now she was doing it on a scale that made her previous efforts look like a child's game with pocket change. When Arthur returned from London a week later, Florence had prepared a comprehensive report on his holdings, complete with recommendations for improvements. She waited for him in the library, the leather-bound report resting on the desk between them, and she watched as he read through her analysis with that same penetrating focus he brought to everything. "You recommend selling the shipping shares," he observed after several minutes of silence. "The war with France is over. Trade routes are stabilizing, which means shipping profits will normalize to more modest levels. Your shares are currently overvalued due to post-war euphoria. I suggest selling now at peak prices and reinvesting in canal development. Internal transport infrastructure is about to become significantly more important." "Canal development is considered somewhat speculative," he said. "So were the coal shares I purchased in 1813. Speculation is simply investment, where the profit timeline is longer and the analysis more complex. I believe the canals will prove extraordinarily profitable within 5 years." Arthur set down the report and regarded her with an expression she could not quite read. "You have identified inefficiencies I was not aware existed. This analysis is exceptional." "Thank you. I am pleased with my decision to marry you, Florence. You are proving even more valuable than I initially calculated." It was perhaps the strangest compliment Florence had ever received, delivered without warmth but with absolute sincerity. And yet, she found herself oddly satisfied by it. She had proven her worth to this cold, calculating man, demonstrating that she could fulfill her part of their bargain. "I am glad the arrangement is working to your satisfaction," she replied. "Quite so. Now, I believe we should discuss your entry into society as my countess. The season is nearly upon us, and your presence will be required at various functions. I have instructed my secretary to compile a list of the most important events. You will need an entirely new wardrobe, of course. I have arranged for London's finest modiste to visit next week." And so began Florence's education in being a countess, a role she approached with the same analytical precision she brought to investment decisions. She studied society's unwritten rules like a scholar examining ancient texts. She learned which families mattered and why, which matrons held social power, which events were essential and which could be declined. The modiste, Madame Lisette Beaumont, arrived with trunks full of fashion plates and fabric samples. She was a small, sharp-eyed Frenchwoman who circled Florence with the intensity of a sculptor evaluating marble. "The coloring is unusual," she observed in accented English. "But we work with this. The height, this is advantage, and the figure, this is good. You carry yourself well, my lady. You carry yourself better than many who are called beautiful." Over the next month, Madame Beaumont created an entirely new wardrobe for Florence. Gone were the drab greys and severe styles Lady Edith had imposed. In their place came gowns in deep jewel tones that complemented her red hair rather than fighting it. There was emerald silk that matched her wedding ring, sapphire blue that made her unusual eyes look striking, and rich burgundy that transformed her freckles from flaw to exotic detail. "You must never wear pale colors," Madame Beaumont instructed firmly. "The pink, the white, and the yellow, these wash you away, but the deep colors, these make you magnificent. You are not a conventional beauty, my lady. You are something more interesting, and we dress you to show this." When Florence looked at herself in the mirror wearing one of Madame Beaumont's creations, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She was not beautiful, perhaps, not by society's narrow standards, but she was striking and memorable. She was someone who commanded attention rather than deflecting it. Arthur, viewing the results of Madame Beaumont's work, nodded approvingly. "Excellent. You look precisely as a Countess of Blackstone should look. You look formidable." Florence found herself laughing, and the sound surprised her. "Is that truly the aesthetic you were hoping for?" "Naturally, I have no use for a decorative wife. I require one who appears capable of managing an empire, because that is precisely what you will be doing." The London season arrived, and with it came Florence's first true test. The spring ball at Lady Catherine Westbrook's residence was the unofficial opening of the season, and it was attended by every person of consequence in English society. Arthur had accepted the invitation on behalf of both of them, and now Florence stood in her dressing room while her new lady's maid, Emily Sutton, arranged her hair and fastened the emerald necklace Arthur had presented to her that morning. "A wedding gift," he had said, draping the heavy stones around her neck. "It is somewhat belated, but I thought you might find use for them this evening. They were my mother's." The emeralds were magnificent, being perfectly matched stones set in gold, worth more than Florence's entire previous life, and he had given them to her with the same casual efficiency. He brought to all their interactions, as if transferring a significant piece of family jewelry were merely another administrative task. Now preparing to face society as his Countess for the first time, Florence felt the weight of those emeralds like a talisman. She was no longer the ugly stepsister hidden away in shame. She was the Countess of Blackstone, wife to one of England's wealthiest and most powerful peers, and she would not allow anyone to make her feel inferior ever again. "You look beautiful, my lady," Emily breathed, stepping back to survey her work. "I look adequate," Florence corrected gently, "but adequacy will suffice." Arthur was waiting at the base of the stairs, dressed in formal evening attire that made him look even more intimidating than usual. His grey eyes swept over her in evaluation, and he nodded once. "Perfect. You will outshine every vapid debutante in attendance without even trying." "That was not my objective." "No, but it will be a pleasant side effect nonetheless. Shall we?" The carriage ride to Lady Westbrook's residence was conducted in silence, but Florence found it a comfortable quiet. They had settled into a rhythm over the past weeks, which was a pattern of interaction that worked for both of them. They discussed business each morning over breakfast. They dined together most evenings when Arthur was in residence, and they occupied the same house and managed the same estate. They presented a unified front to the world. It was not a conventional marriage, but it functioned with remarkable efficiency. Lady Westbrook's ballroom was already crowded when they arrived, and Florence felt the familiar tightening in her chest as they were announced. But this time, the whispers that followed their entrance were different. "The new Countess of Blackstone," someone whispered. "I heard she was quite plain, but look at her. That emerald set must be worth £20,000. They say she manages all his holdings." They were married within 3 weeks of meeting. It is the most extraordinary match of the decade. Lady Westbrook herself approached immediately, her curtsy deep and respectful. "My Lord Blackstone, Lady Blackstone, how delightful to see you both. Your presence honors my humble gathering." "Lady Westbrook," Arthur replied with a slight bow, "we are pleased to attend. My wife was most eager to make her proper debut into society." Florence smiled, and her expression was carefully calibrated. "Your ballroom is magnificent, Lady Westbrook. The arrangements are exquisite. They were immediately surrounded by society's elite, all pressing forward to meet the infamous new Countess. Florence recognized several faces from the Earl's ball, where she had been mocked, but now those same people greeted her with fawning respect. Lady Violet Ashbury actually curtsied to her, though the malice in her eyes suggested she had not forgotten their previous encounter. "Lady Blackstone," she simpered, "what a transformation you have undergone. Marriage clearly agrees with you." "Indeed it does, Lady Violet. And how are your daughters? I understand they remain unmarried?" The barb landed with precision, and Lady Violet's smile tightened. "The season has only just begun. I am certain suitable matches will be found. Of course, though one should not wait too long, opportunities can vanish so quickly." Florence's voice remained perfectly pleasant, but her meaning was clear. Lady Violet had mocked her chances, and now she stood as a countess, while Lady Violet's daughters remained without prospects. Throughout the evening, Florence danced with Arthur twice, which was the maximum propriety allowed even for married couples, and she used the time to observe society's dynamics. With her characteristic analytical precision, she noted which families held real power versus those who merely pretended. She identified the social hierarchies, the alliances and enmities, and the unspoken rules that governed this glittering world. "You are strategizing," Arthur observed during their second dance, his hand at her waist guiding her through a waltz. "I can see your mind working." "Society is simply another market," Florence replied. "It has its own rules and patterns and opportunities for intelligent capital ventures." "That is a remarkably cold way of viewing it," he said. "I learned from an excellent teacher in calculating approaches to life." His lips twitched in that ghost of a smile she was beginning to recognize. "Touché, my dear. Though I confess, I find your analytical nature quite refreshing. Most women would be overwhelmed by their first season as a countess. I am not most women. No, you are decidedly not, which is precisely why I married you." As they turned in the dance, Florence caught sight of a familiar figure near the refreshment tables. Helena, her half-sister, wearing a gown that was fine but not exceptional, was standing beside a man who was clearly her merchant husband. Helena's eyes met Florence's across the ballroom, and her face twisted with an expression of such pure envy and rage that Florence almost pitied her. Almost, but not quite. The evening concluded with Lady Westbrook entreating them to attend her garden party the following week, which was an invitation Florence accepted with gracious assurance. As they rode home in the carriage, Arthur reviewed the evening's social maneuvers with the same precision he brought to reviewing financial reports. "You handled Lady Violet masterfully. The comment about her daughters was perfectly calibrated to wound without being overtly hostile." "She earned it," Florence replied simply. "Indeed she did. You are adapting to your new position with remarkable skill. I confess I was uncertain whether you would take to society, given your previous experiences, but you appear to be thriving." Florence considered this, looking out at the London streets passing by in the darkness. "I am not thriving in society. I am dominating it. There is a difference." Arthur laughed, and the sound was so unexpected that Florence turned to stare at him. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it transformed his severe features into something almost approachable. "What is amusing?" she asked. "You are, Florence. You are perhaps the most ruthlessly ambitious person I have ever encountered, present company included. I chose more wisely than I knew." "Is that approval I detect in your voice?" "It is recognition of a kindred spirit. We are both predators, you and I. We simply hunt in different territories." It was a strange thing to say, and yet Florence found it oddly comforting. They understood each other, she and this cold, calculating Earl. They recognized in each other the same fierce determination to succeed, the same refusal to be limited by others' expectations, and the same willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve their goals. Not love, certainly, but perhaps something equally valuable: respect, understanding, partnership. The first year of Florence's marriage passed in a blur of social functions, investment decisions, and gradual transformation. She navigated the season with increasing confidence, building alliances with powerful matrons and carefully destroying the social standing of those who had once mocked her. Her strategies proved brilliantly successful, and she grew Arthur's already substantial fortune by another £80,000 through a combination of canal ventures, strategic land purchases, and aggressive trading in emerging industries. Arthur, for his part, proved to be exactly what he had promised, being a husband who valued her intelligence over conventional sentiment. They maintained separate chambers and a cordial but distant personal relationship. He made no demands for physical intimacy, though Florence sometimes caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher. It was during the autumn of 1816, after they had been married for 18 months, that things between them began to shift in ways neither had anticipated. They were at Blackstone Hall, having retreated from London after the season ended. Florence had spent the afternoon in the library reviewing quarterly reports from their various holdings, and Arthur had been occupied with estate business. They dined together as usual, and the conversation focused on a potential investment in a new textile manufactory in Manchester. "The profit margins seem sound," Arthur was saying, "but I remain concerned about labor costs. The factory system is still relatively new, and we cannot accurately predict long-term expenses." "I disagree," Florence replied, setting down her wineglass. "Labor costs will actually decrease as the system matures. Specialized tasks performed by dedicated workers are more efficient than the old cottage industry model. The initial capital requirement is higher, but the returns over 5 years will be substantial." "You would commit £30,000 based on that analysis?" "I would commit 50,000. This is the future of manufacturing, Arthur. The war has ended. Demand for textiles is exploding, and those who invest now in the most efficient production methods will dominate the market for the next generation." He studied her across the dinner table, and the candlelight reflected in those pale grey eyes. "You have become remarkably confident in your recommendations. I have been proven correct often enough to trust my own judgment, and you hired me specifically for that judgment." "I did, though I confess the arrangement has evolved beyond my initial expectations." "How so?" Arthur was quiet for a moment, and his expression was difficult to read. "I anticipated a business partnership, a mutually beneficial arrangement. What I did not anticipate was that I would come to genuinely value your company beyond your financial acumen." Florence felt something flutter in her chest, and it was unfamiliar and slightly uncomfortable. "That is a surprisingly sentimental statement from you, is it not? I find myself making them more frequently of late. It is most disconcerting." "Should I be alarmed?" she asked. "Probably. I appear to be developing actual affection for you, which was certainly not part of our original agreement." The confession was delivered in his typical cold, analytical tone, as if he were reporting on an unexpected market development rather than admitting to feelings. And yet, Florence found her heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with business or strategy, or any of the safe intellectual pursuits that had defined their relationship. "I see," she managed, and her voice was not quite steady. "Does the prospect disturb you?" Florence set down her fork, her dinner forgotten. "I am not certain. Our arrangement has functioned well precisely because it lacked emotional complications." "Indeed. Which is why I felt it necessary to inform you of this development. I believe in transparency in all my dealings, including this one. My regard for you has grown beyond the parameters we originally established. I find myself thinking of you even when financial matters are not at issue. I enjoy our conversations and I look forward to your company. These are not symptoms I was prepared to experience." "You make it sound like a disease," she said. "In some ways, perhaps it is. Affection creates an exposure of the heart. Such exposure creates risk. I have spent 6 years since my first wife's death avoiding precisely this situation." Florence's mind raced, trying to weigh these words. "What happened to your first wife? You have never spoken of her." Arthur's expression hardened. "She died in childbirth. She died along with our son. It was 1810. I was 30, and she was 19. We had been married less than a year." The pain in his voice, though carefully controlled, was unmistakable. Florence felt something soften in her chest, and she felt a genuine sympathy for this man who had hidden his grief behind calculations and cold business arrangements. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "That must have been devastating." It was instructive. It taught me that emotional attachment leads to unbearable suffering, which is why I determined that any subsequent marriage would be purely practical. There was to be no affection, no exposure of the heart, and no risk of similar pain. He met her eyes across the table. And yet, here I find myself, 18 months into our arrangement, discovering that I have somehow failed to maintain the emotional distance I intended. What are you saying, Arthur? I am saying that I would like to renegotiate the terms of our marriage if you are amenable. I would like to transform this business partnership into something more closely resembling an actual union. I would like permission to court you properly, Florence. I would like to attempt to earn your genuine affection rather than simply your professional respect. Florence stared at him, this cold, calculating man who had married her for her financial acumen and was now confessing to feelings he clearly found deeply inconvenient. And she realized with a start of surprise that her own emotions toward him had shifted as well over these 18 months of partnership and mutual respect. She had come to admire his intelligence, his directness, and his refusal to engage in the emotional manipulation that seemed to define most relationships in their world. She valued his trust in her abilities, and she appreciated his dry wit and his absolute reliability in all their dealings. And somewhere in the midst of all that admiration and appreciation, she had developed something that might, if she were honest with herself, be the beginning of genuine affection. I would be amenable to renegotiation, she said carefully, though I confess I am uncertain what courting would look like between two people who are already married. Neither am I, truthfully. Perhaps we might simply spend more time together without the pretense of discussing business. We might take walks through the grounds or ride together, and we might engage in conversation purely for the pleasure of it rather than for strategic purposes. That sounds suspiciously like developing an actual relationship. I believe that is precisely the point, yes, he said. Florence found herself smiling, and she genuinely smiled in a way she had not done since before her father died. Very well, Arthur. You may court your own wife, though I reserve the right to mock you mercilessly if you become overly romantic. I think that risk is minimal. I suspect neither of us is capable of excessive romanticism. True, though I confess I find the prospect of your efforts oddly appealing. Do you? His eyes glittered with something that might have been hope. That is encouraging. They finished their dinner in companionable silence, but something had shifted between them, and an invisible wall was beginning to crumble. When Florence retired to her chambers that evening, she found a leather-bound volume of poetry waiting on her desk, and there was a note in Arthur's precise handwriting. The note said that he was informed that courting traditionally involves the giving of gifts, and he hoped she would accept this as a first installment. He added that the Byron is overrated, but the Wordsworth shows promise. Florence laughed aloud reading the note, then she settled into her chair to examine the book. It was a first edition, being beautifully bound, and when she opened it, she discovered Arthur had marked several poems with small annotations in the margins. He had written his thoughts on the verses in that same precise hand. It was perhaps the least conventionally romantic gift imaginable, and yet Florence found it perfect. He was courting her in a way that suited them both, being intellectual rather than emotional, and based on shared interests rather than empty sentiment. Over the following months, their relationship continued to evolve. Arthur kept his promise to spend time with her beyond business discussions. They rode together through the estate's extensive grounds, and Florence discovered that Arthur was an excellent horseman with an unexpectedly playful, competitive streak. They took long walks through the gardens, and they discussed everything from politics to philosophy to their childhoods. They played chess in the library on winter evenings, and Florence learned that Arthur was a sore loser who nevertheless insisted on learning from his defeats. And gradually, inevitably, the physical distance between them began to diminish. There was a touch that lasted a moment longer than necessary, and they stood closer together than strict propriety required. There was the brush of fingers when exchanging documents. These were small intimacies that built slowly towards something more significant. It was Florence who finally breached the final barrier on a spring evening in 1817, nearly 2 years after their wedding. They were in the library and they were ostensibly reviewing investment reports, but in reality they had spent the past hour discussing a book they had both recently read. Arthur had just made an observation about the author's interpretation of Greek philosophy when Florence looked up from her notes and said quite calmly, "I believe I am ready to renegotiate the physical terms of our arrangement." Arthur went very still, and his pen hovered above the paper. "Are you certain?" "I am. I have given the matter considerable thought, and I find that I would like our marriage to be complete in all aspects, and not merely the financial and social ones." "Florence, I need to be absolutely clear that you feel no pressure or obligation," he said. "I feel neither," she interrupted firmly. "I am making this decision entirely of my own volition, and it is based on my genuine desire for a more intimate relationship with you. Is that sufficiently clear?" "Remarkably so, and it is remarkably arousing if I am being honest." Florence felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she maintained her composure. "I had assumed that would be your reaction, though I confess I am somewhat uncertain about the practical mechanics of the situation." Arthur set down his pen and came around the desk to where she sat. He knelt beside her chair, and he brought their faces level as he took her hand in his. "We have time, Florence. There is no urgency. We can proceed at whatever pace makes you comfortable." "That is very considerate, but also potentially inefficient. Perhaps we might simply retire to your chambers and address the matter directly." His lips twitched in that almost smile. "You wish to approach the consummation of our marriage with the same analytical directness you bring to investment decisions. Is there an alternative approach you would recommend?" she asked. "Several, actually, but I confess your method has a certain practical appeal." What followed over the next several months was a gradual but profound transformation in their relationship. The physical intimacy that developed between them was careful at first, and they were both learning how to be vulnerable with another person. But as trust deepened, so did their connection, until Florence found herself experiencing emotions she had never imagined possible. She loved him, she realized with some surprise. It was not the passionate, all-consuming love of romantic novels, but it was something deeper and more enduring. She loved his intelligence and his absolute reliability. She loved the way he valued her mind as much as any physical attribute. She loved that he had given her freedom and power and respect, and all the things society had tried to deny her. And Arthur, for his part, proved capable of far more warmth than his cold exterior suggested. He became protective without being controlling, and he was affectionate without being cloying. The man who had proposed a business arrangement had become a genuine partner in every sense of the word. By autumn of 1817, Florence discovered she was with child. The news filled her with equal parts terror and joy, and she remembered what Arthur had told her about his first wife's death. But he was immediately reassuring, and he hired the best physicians in England and insisted that no expense be spared for her care and comfort. "I will not lose you," he said fiercely, and he held her hands in his. "I cannot lose you. You have become essential to my existence in ways I did not believe possible." "You are becoming dangerously romantic," Florence teased, though her own voice was unsteady. "I find I no longer care about maintaining emotional distance. I love you, Florence. I love you desperately and completely. I love you with an intensity that would horrify my former self." "I love you as well," she admitted, "though I still find the entire situation somewhat improbable." "Agreed. We are perhaps the least likely love story in English history. But here we are nonetheless." The pregnancy progressed without complication, and in May of 1818, Florence gave birth to twins, being a boy and a girl, and they were both healthy and blessed with their mother's red hair and their father's grey eyes. Arthur wept when he held them for the first time, being overcome with relief and joy and a love so fierce it bordered on ferocity. They named the boy William Edmund, after Florence's father and her loyal solicitor. The girl they called Catherine Alexandra, and they combined Arthur's mother's name with a feminine version of his own. And as Florence watched her husband cradling their tiny children with infinite care, she felt a satisfaction so profound it transcended anything she had ever imagined. She had won. She had taken a desperate situation and transformed it into triumph. She had gone from invisible spinster to powerful countess, and from mocked elder sister to the respected matriarch of one of England's most prominent families. But more than that, She had found genuine partnership and love in the place she least expected it, with a man who had originally seen her as merely a useful asset. They had both been transformed by their unlikely alliance, and they had both learned that the heart was capable of more than calculation and strategy. 2 years later, in May of 1820, the Countess of Blackstone hosted a ball at Blackstone Hall to celebrate her 32nd birthday and her twins' second year. The guest list included everyone who mattered in English society, and Florence surveyed her ballroom with quiet satisfaction. This was the same room where she had first appeared as a figure of mockery, being brought by her stepmother as a cruel contrast to her beautiful half-sisters. Now she stood at its center as its undisputed mistress, and she wore a gown of deep emerald silk that cost more than Lady Edith's entire annual allowance. Her children played in the nursery upstairs under the care of devoted servants, and her husband stood at her side with his hand resting possessively at her waist. Her holdings had grown to over £500,000 through shrewd management. Lady Violet Ashbury approached, and her expression was carefully neutral. "Lady Blackstone, what a magnificent gathering. You have become quite the social force." "Thank you, Lady Violet. And how are your daughters?" Florence asked. "They are still unmarried, I regret to say. The marriage market has become quite competitive." "Indeed it has. Though I confess I have found that true value is often overlooked in favor of more superficial attractions. It is fortunate that some gentlemen possess the wisdom to recognize worth beyond conventional beauty." The comment was calculated to remind Lady Violet of her own mockery years earlier, and from the way the older woman's mouth tightened, the message was received. Helena appeared then, and her merchant husband was trailing behind her. Florence's half-sister had gained weight, and her famous beauty was already beginning to fade at 25. She curtsied to Florence with visible reluctance. "Sister, happy birthday. Your children are lovely," Helena said. "Thank you, Helena. And how is married life treating you?" Florence asked. "It is well enough." Helena's eyes swept the ballroom with naked envy. "Though it is nothing like this, of course. My husband's circumstances are rather more modest." "Yes, I imagine they are. Still, I am certain you are content with your choice. After all, we each end up with precisely what we deserve, do we not?" The barb landed perfectly, and Helena's face flushed with anger and shame. But she could do nothing and say nothing, because Florence now occupied a position so far above her that any insult would be social suicide. Arthur leaned close, and his breath was warm against Florence's ear. "You are being cruel, my love." "I am being just," Florence corrected. "There is a difference." "If you say so. Though I confess I find your ruthlessness quite attractive," he whispered. "You would. You trained me well." "No, my dear. I merely gave you the tools. The ruthlessness was always yours." As the evening progressed, Florence moved through her guests with the confidence of someone who knows she cannot be touched. She accepted compliments, she granted favors to those she deemed worthy, and she subtly punished those who had once mocked her by reminding them of how far she had risen. Later that night, after the last guest had departed and the servants were clearing the ballroom, Florence stood on the terrace where Arthur had first proposed his cold business arrangement. He joined her there with 2 glasses of wine in hand, and together they looked out over the moonlit gardens. "Are you satisfied, Countess?" he asked, and he handed her a glass. Florence considered the question seriously. "I am, though not for the reasons you might expect." "Explain," he said. "I thought I wanted revenge, and I confess there is satisfaction in seeing Lady Edith reduced to dependence, in watching Helena's beauty fade, and in witnessing Lady Violet's daughters remain unwed while I have everything they coveted. But that is not what truly satisfies me." "Then what does?" he asked. "This." Florence gestured to encompass the house, the grounds, and their life together. "A partnership built on genuine respect and affection. I see children who will never know the cruelty I experienced, and I see the freedom to use my mind fully, without apology or limitation. And I have a husband who values me for precisely the qualities society once told me made me worthless." Arthur set down his glass and drew her into his arms, which was something he would never have done in the early days of their marriage. "You are the most formidable woman I have ever encountered, and I count myself extraordinarily fortunate that you were desperate enough to accept my proposal." "I was not that desperate," Florence protested. You were absolutely that desperate, as was I. We saved each other, I think." "That is disgustingly sentimental," she said. "I know I am rather appalled at myself, but I find I no longer care about maintaining my reputation for coldness." Florence laughed and kissed him, being the man who had transformed her life through a combination of calculated strategy and unexpected love. When she pulled back, she said, "They called me ugly. You made me a countess. And now I possess everything they denied me. That is a rather satisfying outcome." "Indeed it is, though for the record I have never found you anything less than magnificent. Liar, you married me for my financial skills," she teased. "Initially, yes, but I fell in love with you for far more than your ability to read market trends." "Such as?" she asked. "I fell in love with your ruthlessness, your intelligence, and your complete refusal to be defeated by circumstances that would have destroyed lesser people. I fell in love with your unexpected capacity for love despite years of cruelty, and I fell in love with your ability to make me laugh. Shall I continue?" "That will suffice for now, though I reserve the right to request additional compliments at a later date." "Naturally. You are, after all, a countess. Demanding tribute is well within your rights." They stood together on the terrace, and they looked toward a future that neither of them could have imagined when they first met in a moonlit garden. It was a future built not on romantic fantasy, but on something more valuable, being mutual respect and genuine partnership, and the absolute certainty that they were better together than they could ever be apart. 3 years later, Florence would publish her first treatise on economic theory under her own name, and she would fascinate society in equal measure. 5 years later, Arthur would be appointed to the Financial Committee of the House of Lords based on the performance of his holdings, and everyone knew his wife was the true genius behind the success. 7 years later, their children would be enrolled in the finest schools, with young William showing his mother's gift for mathematics and Catherine displaying her father's strategic mind. But tonight, on this May evening in 1820, they were simply two people who had found each other against all odds and built something extraordinary from what should have been merely a cold business arrangement. "I love you, Florence Hartley, Countess of Blackstone," Arthur said quietly. "I love you, Arthur Hartley, Earl of Blackstone," Florence replied, "though I still maintain our entire story is completely absurd." "Agreed, but I would not change a single moment of it," he said. "Neither would I. Well, perhaps I would have preferred to avoid the public humiliation. But then you would not have experienced the exquisite pleasure of proving them all wrong." "Fair point. Very well. I would not change anything." They sealed this declaration with a kiss, and somewhere in the house their red-haired twins slept peacefully, unaware that their very existence was proof that the most unlikely matches could become the deepest loves. Florence had been raised to believe she was nothing. Arthur had coldly calculated she was worth £400,000 in management potential, and together they had discovered she was priceless. Not a fairy tale, not a romance for the ages, but something better. It was a true partnership built on respect and trust and the absolute refusal to accept the limitations others tried to impose. The elder daughter had become a countess, and in doing so, she had taught England that value came not from beauty or breeding, but from strength, intelligence, and the courage to rewrite one's own story. And that, Florence thought as she rested her head against her husband's shoulder, was the most satisfying revenge of all. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of love, resilience, and hope.